gap between the eagerness to produce peace as soon as possible, ASAP, which has produced certain formulas which were out of touch with the nature of the Middle East. And the nature of the Middle East does not lend itself by definition to quick solutions, certainly not oversimplified solutions. If at all, any solution, again, if you look at the Middle East way beyond the very narrow context of the Arab-Israeli conflict, we're talking about an area which at least for the last 14 centuries has been an area defying solutions, defying peaceful coexistence among the Arabs themselves, among the Islamic societies in the Middle East. Another reason in my mind for the failure of every single American peace initiative, and again I emphasize, well-intentioned peace initiative, another reason has been a fundamental element shaping those peace initiatives, and that element has been the assumption that the Palestinian issue is the crux of the Arab-Israeli conflict, a crown jewel of Arab policymaking, and a major cause for Middle East turbulence. None of the above has anything to do with very well documented reality. I don't want to belabor the point, but you take the initial Arab-Israeli war, 48-49, the war was over, Egypt occupied Gaza, never occurred to Cairo to transfer Gaza to the Palestinians. Iraq occupied, conquered Samaria, the northern West Bank, never occurred to them either, and they transferred it to their cousins in Jordan. And Jordan went ahead and annexed Judea and Samaria, April 1950, to the East Bank, hence the term West Bank, but never occurred not to Jordan, not to Egypt. In fact, Syria occupied parts of the Golan, which were supposed to be part of the Palestinian State. None of them entered the war on behalf of the Palestinians, and none of them was going to depart from area occupied and share it with the Palestinians. We're talking basically about a tremendous gap between the nature of the Middle East, which is highly unpredictable, unstable, violently intolerant on one hand, and very well-intentioned but highly simplistic solutions which have been submitted by series of American administrations. And certainly there is a problem with initiatives which are based on the moral equivalence, namely we're going to approach the Arab side and the Israeli side in a similar manner. There's a problem when you ignore the systematic anti-American stance by, in this case, Palestinians on one hand, and the systematic pro-American stance by all Israeli governments, and certainly for the US to present an initiative obligates the Arabs as a whole or the Palestinians to outflank the US from the more demanding side, more maximalist or more radical side, which adds one more hurdle to the already highly challenging reality in that context. On the other hand, we have seen two successful initiatives, and I qualify it as of now. They have been successful Israel, Egypt, Israel, Jordan. Both of them were initiated directly between Israel and an Arab partner. In fact, the initial one with Egypt was against the wishes of then President Jimmy Carter, who jumped on the bandwagon about a week or 10 days later. However, while both of them were directly initiated, directly negotiated, not through a third-party initiative, it was the US which played a most critical role as a facilitator of the conclusion of those two peace treaties. Without the US involvement in the facilitating stage, probably we wouldn't have peace agreement between Israel and Egypt and Israel and Jordan. And I mention that because the US does have a unique role, but not as an initiator, rather as a facilitator. And to wrap it up, I would say that for the US to submit an initiative which highlights, in this case, the Palestinian issue, Israel-Palestinian relations, as a major issue which requires the attention of the superpower in the world, ignores the order of priorities in the Middle East, which does not rank the Palestinian issue or the Arab-Israeli conflict as a top element in the Middle East. Some people refer to the Arab-Israeli conflict as the Middle East conflict. It has never been the Middle East conflict. It's an Arab-Israeli, which again plays a secondary, tertiary, if at all, any such role in the overall context of the Middle East. For the US to accord such attention to the Palestinian issue does not reflect positively on the US stance as a superpower, or does not provide any more weight to the US posture of deterrence in the Middle East and beyond. A friend here reminded me last night about a certain Texas colloquialism, which I would like to wrap up my presentation with, when it comes to focusing on a junior league issue rather than NBA league issue. And in Texas, they suggest when driving in West Texas and being smothered by a West Texas sandstorm, don't be preoccupied with the tumbleweeds. Thank you very much.
So the opening of the embassy, the American embassy in Jerusalem in May marked a peak emotional moment for those interested in the U.S.-Israel relationship. And Donald Trump was widely hailed as Israel's best man ever in the White House. To which I say, maybe. There's also reason to think that the recognition of the embassy was not just fulfilling a campaign promise, not simply a goodwill gesture towards a valued ally, but rather part of a much more complex approach that I call a three-part drama. Now let me start, before I get into the drama, by saying that how I understand our president is that he began his career, his career was, through the decades, a real estate developer. I myself am not a real estate developer, but from what I understand, it's a complex business of reaching out to the various stakeholders, the partners in the deal, the unions, the neighbors, the building inspectors, the banks, and so forth. And from what I understand, you give each one something to be happy, and you got your deal. I propose that what Donald Trump is, I speculate, I don't know, I speculate that what he's doing in the Middle East now is to bring about the ultimate deal by following this same approach. And what are his goals here? It's not to have a building, it's to have two things. One is to contain and ideally change the regime in Iran. Two is to solve the Arab-Israeli conflict. Now these are related, because if you want to really be effective against Iran, if you want to get the partners in the region to work together. You need the Israelis to work with the Saudis and the other Arab states. And if you want that, then you have to take care of the Palestinian issue, which has always been an obstacle and is today an obstacle to Israeli working cooperation with the Arab states. So they're together. The two goals are intertwined. So part one is you give the Saudis a lot of attention. Where's your firstborn troop? You have this spectacular with sword dancing and hands on a globe, and hundreds of $1 billion of sales. You couldn't ask for more. The Saudis got the attention they wanted. The Israelis, you look at the Israelis and say, what do the Israelis want? What can we give them? Jerusalem. Recognize it, put the embassy there. Easy. Palestinians, what do they want? Here the speculation begins. Well, they want Palestine, with Jerusalem as its capital. Give it to them. You can give it to them. We can recognize Palestine and Jerusalem as capital. And then once you've done that, you set the stage for taking care of the Palestinian issue and getting a solid front against the Iranians. So this is not pure speculation. Let me give you some evidence for my coming to this conclusion. First, Trump has said that he recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital to settle the Jerusalem issue. He said, quote, the hardest subject that Israeli and Palestinian negotiators had to talk about was Jerusalem. We took Jerusalem off the table, so we don't have to talk about it anymore. Done. Now this is slightly not true. There was a big reaction, the United Nations, Organization of Islamic Cooperation, and so forth, but that's not the point. The point is that Trump thinks that recognition solved the knotty Jerusalem issue as though this were a New York real estate deal, and he made a side deal about zoning regulations or union representation. Done. Jerusalem's out of the way. Two, Trump has indicated he intends to exact an unspecified price from Israel for this recognition, stating, quote, Israel will pay for that, unquote. We don't know what the payment is, but logic suggests it is what I told you before. Third, Mahmoud Abbas, head of the Palestinian Authority, has implicitly confirmed that American negotiators have offered him Abu Dis. Abu Dis is a fairly remote part of Jerusalem. The Israelis got Jerusalem in 1967 into Little Jerusalem, they made it into Big Jerusalem. It's the parts of Jerusalem that are distant from where we think of Jerusalem. And one of them is Abu Dis. And the idea is that it will be formerly Jerusalem, but in fact not really adjacent to what we understand as Jerusalem, or not part of what we understand as Jerusalem. So Mahmoud Abbas has said that Abu Dis has implied that Abu Dis is what the Americans are offering. Fourth, in an interview in February, Trump answered the question, will Israel have to give something in return for the decision on Jerusalem? I'm bringing together several parts of his answer. I think both sides will have to make hard compromises to reach a peace agreement, both sides. Right now, I would say the Palestinians are not looking to make peace. They're not looking to make peace. And I'm not necessarily sure that Israel is looking to make peace. I think it is very foolish for the Palestinians, and I also think it would be very foolish for the Israelis if they don't make a deal. It is our only opportunity, and it will never happen after this. So taking these various pieces of evidence, in summary, Trump has reiterated prior warnings about the hard compromises ahead for both Israel and the Palestinians. He has said that relations with Israel will improve after reaching an agreement with the Palestinians. And perhaps most significantly, he's expressed doubts about the Israelis even wanting this. In addition, leaks from the Arab press have indicated all sorts of Trump plans. They're somewhat self-contradictory, but all of them agree Palestine with Jerusalem as its capital. Now, of course, following their own unique logic, the Palestinian Authority cut off relations right after the recognition of Jerusalem. And the Trump administration has not been able to forward the plan because there's no one there to look at it, listen to it. But I suspect that one of these days, either Mahmoud Abbas or his successor will be finished playing to the Palestinian street, and he will mumble apologies He will lavish praise on the American president. He will fire up the Palestinians' great mass of proxies, and he'll start to, quote, talk peace, unquote, with Israel. Once he does that, great benefits await. And then Trump expects his anti-Iran alliance to be in place and the ultimate deal to have been made. The Nobel Prize is clearly on its way. It's just one hitch, however. The Palestinian leaders, as I'm sure you're all aware, shamelessly say whatever they need to say to get what they want, and then they renege on it immediately. The most notorious example is the Oslo Accords of 1993, but there are plenty of other examples. This deceit compels the Israelis to crack down with checkpoints, make arrests, and even shoot at Palestinians, which is something we witness quite often, most recently on the Gaza border with the kites. So this story is very badly for Israel. And my question is, if I am accurate in my prediction, will Jerusalem recognition have been worth Palestine? Is it really such a good deal after all? And when this takes place, this recognition of Palestine, all those who are upset about Jerusalem, the Pope in Rome, the German Chancellor, the Saudi Crown Prince, and the New York Times will be congratulating a very happy Trump on his understanding of the nature of the problem. And Israel will find itself thrust out of favor. And all of those from the Prime Minister to major organizations in the city who have been enthusiastic about Trump from a pro-Israel point of view will find that they can't say much. He's the best thing that ever happened to Israel. How can they take that back? As Israel's defense minister, Rafa Crossing, said after a trip to Washington, there is no free lunch. And as I concluded in an article on the subject back in February, I've been wrong many times about Donald Trump in the past. I hope I'm wrong this time too.
I don't know if it's optimism. Maybe I'm just a little bit more optimistic than my co-panelists. What I'm going to share with you today is based on conversations that I've had with folks inside the Trump administration, but also elsewhere around the region. I think I'll share the view of Daniel that it's very hard to talk about this because we don't know everything yet. But based on what I've heard and based on what I've read, I think I can piece together some of it, and I'll share with you why I think there's some room for optimism, but ultimately we've got a tough road ahead. So first, let me just start with the basic premise that Oslo and the overall two-state solution has failed because we here in the United States have treated both sides as equals. We've treated the Israelis and the Palestinians as if they came to the table with equal power. And nothing could be further than the truth. The Israelis have the upper hand in the power dynamic. The Palestinians have very little. The Israelis don't like being told that they're going to have to give away more than they need to, and the Palestinians obviously love the idea that they're being given more concessions up front, and this has created a friction. I would say the primary friction being that Israelis don't like to be what they call friars. They don't like to be suckers, and that is a big issue. But also, look, the whole idea of empowering the Palestinians when they don't have power is, I just don't think it lends itself to success. Also, making things difficult. Terrorism and poor governance. We saw this with Yasser Arafat. Under Abbas, we saw poor governance again and a rise in corruption unlike anything we've seen in the rest of the Arab world. And yet, right now, after all of these mistakes, we are seeing experts scoff at Trump for trying his hand at the two-state solution. And what they're going to say, what they continue to say, is that he is the least well-read, the least diplomatic, the least prepared president in modern history to try his hand at this, and ditto for Jared Kushner, for Jason Greenblatt, and they may not be wrong. But what I would say is that this team at the White House does seem to be correcting the mistakes of the other so-called experts in the past. They're not treating the Palestinians as equals. They are coming at this by giving the Israelis more of the power up front, the Palestinians less of it up front. They're addressing corruption, they're addressing terrorism, and I would say that that's a refreshing difference that we're seeing right now so far. So exactly how are they beginning to address this? Number one, borders. According to the reports that we've seen about this ongoing process, the Israelis are not going to be going back to the Olmert or to the Ehud Barak borders, the 97% of the West Bank going to the Palestinians, that doesn't appear to be on the table. It actually appears to be significantly smaller. This is one of the reasons why the Palestinians have been upset, and we've seen them talk about this. The issue of settlements. It's not coming up. This is not the mantra right now coming out of this administration. Hearing Israeli officials talk about it early on in the Trump administration, they were saying that the Israelis were given approval to build up, but not out. So in other words, there was nothing wrong with continuing to build on existing settlements, and this has obviously given the Israelis some additional leverage. Then you have the issue of Jerusalem. I think the decision to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital, of course, people were saying that it was controversial. I don't think it was terribly controversial at all. But what's interesting about it is that the Palestinians continue to say that if you do this, if you recognize Jerusalem as Jewish, then here we are, we're holding this grenade, we're going to pull the pin, and it's going to explode. The entire region is going to explode. Turns out it looked like the Palestinians were holding a pomegranate by the end of this thing. I mean, really, nothing happened as a result of this recognition, and what it did is it effectively destroyed the Palestinian narrative about Jerusalem, paving the way for a potential two-state solution. Similarly, refugees. Right now we're seeing a lot in the news about UNRWA, this UN agency that has taken the initial 800,000 Palestinian refugees and magically turned them into 5 million over the course of the conflict, when in fact we now know, according to documents that have been at least partially released and redacted, that the actual number is closer to 20 or 30,000 refugees, thereby, again, debunking a Palestinian claim that has been a traditional roadblock to the two-state solution. So in other words, the Trump administration has been systematically dismantling the traditional Palestinian barriers to this two-state solution. The problem, of course, is that the Palestinians will not agree to what's going on. They continue to be the primary stumbling block in the two-state solution. They don't want to recognize the state of Israel, and they're irate. If you look at the responses, the spat between Greenblatt and Erekat in the press, and the sort of anger that Abbas has expressed as the administration has steadily eroded the Palestinian position, they're unhappy about this and they refuse to engage. So how can this succeed? This is, I think, the real question. If the Palestinians are furious, the Trump administration is eroding their position, how do we move forward? The key is supposedly the Sunni Gulf Arab states, as Daniel mentioned. And from there, I mean, I think it's interesting to note that the Israelis and the Sunni Arab states have this fear of Iran that has driven them closer together. What I think the Arab world has realized is that Israel is the best enemy they ever had. That Israel is more of an ally than an enemy, and it certainly appears to be moving in that direction that much more quickly. The joke around town, of course, is that it was the Iran nuclear deal that ultimately pushed them together. Obama got a Nobel Prize in 2009 for basically just changing course from Trump. I think he probably should have received it in 2015 when he signed the nuclear deal, not because he prevented Iran from going nuclear, but because he forced the Arabs and Israel to begin talking in ways that no one could have imagined. And now there's this mutual alliance with Trump. Both the Sunni Arab states and the Israelis have a sort of an affinity for Trump, and they are moving closer and closer together in what is being described as a regional architecture. And the key now, theoretically, is for the Sunni Arab states to push the Palestinians toward a compromise. They need something from Israel in order to be able to do that, and if they get something on the table, then they can go to the Palestinians and say, the train is leaving, and it's going to leave without you if you don't get on board. Now, there's a lot that needs to happen in order to see that line up. But for a while, it appeared that there could be room for optimism, but not lately. Lately, I think we're seeing that Mohammed bin Salman, the powerful crown prince of Saudi Arabia, doesn't seem to have quite the sway that he did before. He seems to have receded a bit from the spotlight. There was a public statement about a disagreement that he's had with his father, King Salman, about this regional architecture and whether or not Saudi Arabia can get on board. There's also a question now about Trump's commitment to the peace process. He had initially hoped to roll out something in the spring. Now we're seeing that he's going to be pushing it until after midterm elections, and it could even be further than that if there are Israeli elections held too. And of course, we continue to see the same obstinance on the part of the Palestinian side. So if the Arab world is not there, if they cannot somehow cajole the Palestinians to get on board, the Palestinians are certainly not going to do it themselves. So in short, we don't know exactly where things are leading. We understand that the Palestinians are weaker than they were, which I think is positive, but this is still a moving target. Whether or not Trump is able to make the Middle East great again, I don't think we can predict. But it is a different dynamic than we've seen in the past, and for that I am slightly more optimistic than I have been before. Thank you.
And he said that I recommended 94 to 96% of the West Bank for the Palestinians with a land swap from Israel of 1 to 3%. He also said that on refugees, I said that the new state of Palestine should be the homeland for refugees displaced in the 1948 war and afterward, without ruling out the possibility that Israel would accept some of the refugees according to its own laws and sovereign decisions. On Jerusalem, I recommended that the Arab neighborhoods be in Palestine and the Jewish neighborhoods in Israel, and that the Palestinians should have sovereignty over the Temple of Mount or Haram al-Sharif, and the Israelis sovereignty over the Western Wall and the holy space of which it is a part. Finally, the agreement had asked for an end to violence. Once again, I might add.
Well, it goes back to the point I raised, that any American peace initiative which has to do with the Palestinian-Israeli dialogue, relations, conflict, must radicalize the Palestinian side, must force the Palestinians to outflank the Americans from the radical side. But more fundamentally, in my mind, at a time when the US is faced with a real, clear and present and possibly lethal threat posed by the Ayatollahs to American interest in the Middle East, Indian Ocean and beyond, certainly to every single ally of America in the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Peninsula, at a time when you have multitude of Islamic Sunni terrorist organizations equally threatening the very fragile Middle East. However, at a time when, as Jonathan highlighted, Israel-Saudi Arabia cooperation is at an all-time high, and this is not only limited to homeland security, national security, but there are also some commercial aspects there. Likewise with Abu Dhabi and Dubai and Bahrain and Oman, certainly Egypt and Jordan. At this time, to present a peace initiative would be equal, in my mind, to throwing a fly into the ointment. And it would inflame rather than add water to the already very, very unpredictably violent region.
I note that in addition to the Clinton parameters that you read, subsequent presidents, Bush and Obama, have offered yet more. For example, Clinton didn't recognize a Palestinian state. Bush didn't make the kind of deals, offers that Obama did. But I am someone, whatever the question is, I have the same answer. And my answer is Israel victory. Yeah, this is all nonsense. No plan is going to work. The only way to end the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is to convince the Palestinians the gig is up and they lost. That's not going to happen through plans. That's going to happen by telling the Israelis, go win your war. Win it through, by gaining victory within moral, legal, and practical limitations. Go convince the Palestinians that by any standard, they are defeated. I like to compare the Palestinians to the Japanese lieutenant who in 1974, 29 years after the Japanese emperor had given up, in 1974 he finally laid down his arms. The Palestinians are a bit like that. It's 25 years and a month since they acknowledged that they lost, and yet they're still fighting on and on and on. Time to convince them they lost.
if this peace plan were to impose peace upon the Palestinians with less than they have been expecting all along, forcing them to reconcile with their weakened position, forcing them to understand that they are not splitting Jerusalem, forcing them to understand that they are not going to have 5 million refugees returning to what they call Palestine. The question is, if that was done with the United States in concert with the Israelis, would that be sufficient? Would that constitute the kind of victory that we're talking about, especially if the Arab world were to somehow come along with this? Now again, there's a lot that has to happen. This is what it appears to be. I mean, this appears to be the trajectory that the Trump administration is trying to put us on. The question is, would that satisfy your sort of qualifications for a victory?
If I took all your ifs as realities, yes. But as you heard, I don't think that's the way things are going. I think the Palestinians will be given a great president. Don't you think that too? Do you think they're not going to be given Palestine, which was something like that?
I think they're going to be given a lot less than they want, and it's for that reason that Abbas and others are going to almost certainly walk away. Everything we're hearing right now from the Palestinian side suggests that they are going to reject, before they even hear the offer, they're going to reject it. I mean, they're not even talking to the Trump administration right now, which I tend to see as kind of a good sign.
I tend to as well, but it's illogical, and eventually they will come to the table. No doubt.
I'm not sure.
I would like to add maybe an additional angle here, and this is, I think, the safest formula, namely reliance on track record. Many times we tend to ignore track record in order to avoid complications and difficulties and create a supposed very friendly, simple environment. The track record suggests that back in 1948-49, with something like 650,000 Jews with hardly any military power, with I think it was $1 billion GDP for Israel, the Prime Minister, the founding father of Israel, was faced with outrageous American administration pressure led by then General George Marshall, Secretary of State, who could have been elected also to the president if he would have agreed to run on behalf of or in the Democratic primaries. Anyway, Ben-Gurion was pressured to withdraw from so-called occupied areas of 1948-49, which added to the state of Israel 50% area, 50%. And Ben-Gurion, with the meager resources at his disposal, stood in front of the American ambassador those days, James McDonald, and as James McDonald wrote, I was astounded. Here is the short man listening to the ultimatum from the general, the Second World War hero, George Marshall, and he gives me a simple answer: no, no, and no. And that was the end of that chapter. Israel at that time did not follow the inflaming formula of Lent for Peace, which basically rewards aggression and entices aggression and ignores reality. And lo and behold, we still are sustaining that, the fruits of that position upheld by Ben-Gurion. And the question, when we are about to be faced with another American peace initiative, and we don't know what it will be, are we going to study the Ben-Gurion position and analyze it and try to learn from it in order to avoid mistakes rather than repeat mistakes? Or are we going, once again, are we going to ignore the Ben-Gurion lesson of 1948-49, which undoubtedly, in my mind, is going to further inflame terrorism and wars in the Middle East?
It's a good question, and I obviously don't have any deep insight into what is going on between the Saudis and the Trump administration. But from what I understand, the Saudis and the rest of the Sunni Arab states, and this is from visits that I've made to some of those states in recent years, they're seeing the Palestinian issue as less of their own national interest right now. That they're more interested in the Iran issue, they're more interested in countering Iran. We have this new initiative that's going to be coming out, I think, in October, about some kind of an Arab NATO to protect against Iranian aggression. If the Trump administration can somehow deliver Iran, and that's another big if, and the Israelis provide something, an agreement to come to the table based on certain terms, that may yet be enough. The problem that I mentioned at the end of my prepared remarks is that whereas it looked as if the Saudis were heading in this direction, they now appear to have either had a change in power dynamic or the leadership itself is having some cold feet. It was MBS, the Crown Prince, who was driving all of this, and it did seem as if we were all moving in the right direction. Now all of a sudden MBS has receded. There is this public disagreement with he and his father about the so-called regional dynamic or regional architecture that they were trying to create in the region. So I don't know what would be enough for the Arab states. I don't know whether anything short of Israel fully capitulating would be enough for them. I'm still not convinced that they are fully willing to accept Israel as a Jewish state, as their neighbor in the region. But I do think that the current dynamic certainly does appear to be worth exploring. Observations. One is on a recent trip to Israel in May. This is right as the balloon and kite incidences began and the shooting at the border began. I was talking with a senior Israeli official who said, look, we don't have a strategy for Gaza. We have no creativity. We've been focused on other things, pulling documents out of the nuclear warehouse in Iran, taking out Iranian targets in Syria. This is where we've been focusing our efforts. We don't know how to handle Gaza anymore other than simple deterrence. And there is a frustration, I would say, on the part of the Israeli military establishment that they haven't quite figured out how to alleviate some of the pressure that's been building there. And so they're trying lots of different things. Some I agree with, some I don't. I believe that deterrence against Hamas is the only way forward. Taking out their top leadership, as they did back in 2003, 2004, would be a good place to start. That's not where they're heading right now. They appear to be willing to make some concessions, working with the Egyptians, working, in fact, with the Qataris and the Turks, who are, at this point, full-on enemies of Israel, and they're working with them to try to ensure that the people of Gaza get what they need through Hamas, which is dedicated to Israel's destruction. So I would say that we're watching an Israeli leadership that is they're throwing a lot of things at the wall to see what sticks, and I think that some of these decisions have been dangerous.
If I can add something here, Israel has faced for many years when it comes to Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Gaza, as it also has faced when it comes to Palestinian terrorism from Judea and Samaria. There are basically two general approaches. One is reactive, firm reaction, feeble reaction, but reactive, and the other one is proactive, deterrence, but through proactive. And certainly this has to do also with many difficult issues in our life when it comes to our health. You can have a doctor who identifies cancer in your body and he proposes, let's wait until it develops and then we'll hit it very hard. Or you want to preempt the disease. Likewise with terrorism, it's either preemptive or reactive. And by the way, the same thing is facing the US when it comes to the Ayatollahs and the Ayatollahs' daily subversive and terrorist activities throughout the Persian Gulf, in Yemen and beyond those areas. And therefore, this is up to the Israelis to decide, are we going to learn from our track record, which is replete with reacting and severe cost of this reactive approach, or are we going to go back to the preemptive approach, which in sum has yielded much lower cost than the reactive one?
We would certainly not encourage anything like this. I think one of the first casualties of Oslo and subsequent peace processes is the dilution of the word peace, of the meaning of the word peace. You know, peace does not mean rewarding bad behavior with statehood. And, you know, it's just a kind of Orwellian doublespeak to use this kind of term peace, but, you know, that kind of word stops everybody's gray cells in their brain from thinking peace. You know, they're not really thinking with their heads, they're thinking with their hearts. So we would never, ever encourage something where we see that America's one democratic ally in the region is going to have to submit to, you know, these years and years of terrorism with rewards. So,
but would you try, you were very influential, would you try and discourage the administration from coming forward with this proposal at this time?
yeah, I'm actually really fortunate to have some friends in the administration that I'm meeting with, and I would definitely do that.
Well, there are those who say that the Palestinians never miss a chance to miss a chance. And so you don't have to worry because they'll say no. But I don't think that's true. The Palestinians certainly took Oslo and many other deals after Oslo. And if I'm right, and they're offered Palestine with Jerusalem as its capital, mind you, that would be central Jerusalem, they'll say, sure, thanks. And they'll be asked to, for example, give up the right of return and perhaps some other things. They'll say, sure, but we know that they're not going to do it. Remember, for example, the flap 20-some years ago over the PLO charter, which never changed. There were months of negotiations and back and forth. Nothing will change. They'll take this, they'll pocket it, and nothing will change. There will be jihadi attacks on the Israelis as before, etc., etc., etc. So it is of no use, and that is why I say, again, they have to have a sense of defeat. They have to understand it's over. This isn't going to happen.
There's one very critical issue, which as far as I know, has not been addressed by US policymakers, and that is the simple question: would a Palestinian state in Judea and Samaria, 100%, 80%, 60%, whatever, would such a state enhance or undermine America's national security, irrespective of what the Israelis want? At the end of the day, it should be, and it is, American own interest which underlines America's policy. And certainly, when you observe, again, the track record of the Palestinians, the track record of the Middle East, the conclusion is very obvious. You establish a Palestinian state west of the river, you doom the relatively pro-US Hashemite regime east of the river. You doom, you cause the toppling of the Hashemites east of the river. You cannot avoid the ripple effect into Saudi Arabia and the rest of the Arabian Peninsula. You establish a Palestinian state, whether it is in Judea, Samaria, and Gaza, or only in Gaza. You have to assume that you may have, in the following weeks, months, a year or so, you could have air base, naval base, or rights, land rights for Russia, possibly for Iran, possibly for China, in the eastern flank of the Mediterranean. And certainly, if you have a Palestinian state in Judea, Samaria, which means that Israel retreats back to this sliver along the Mediterranean, you are going to deny the US the availability of very unique ally in the Middle East, which extends the hand, the strategic hand of the US, which spares the US to deploy to the area maybe a few more real aircraft carriers, some land divisions, all of which would be the outcome of a Palestinian state. And therefore, it seems to me that it's time for people to think about the impact on America's interest and what do our friends in Israel want and what do the Palestinians want.
I would just want to add one thing to Aaron, your question, Aaron. One is, two big points. One is that there is the question of Abbas's legitimacy. The guy does not control the Gaza Strip, and how the Gaza Strip is going to be included in some way in this process, to me, is incredibly unclear. I believe that the Hamas-Fatah split, the spat that I wrote about in the book 10 years ago, it endures to this day. It is a sticking point for this administration. I don't think they have any way of moving forward to include Gaza, and so it will always be this sort of outlier, no matter what kind of deal is reached, because Hamas is not going to be party to it, and I think we need to be aware of that. Number two is the legitimacy of Abbas himself, which you mentioned. He is now, I believe it's 13 years into a 4-year term. 80-something years old, packaged smoker. He's been in and out of the hospital. He's on his way out, and the question is, what's going to happen when he leaves? There is no vice president. There's a vice president of the Fatah faction, but there is not a vice president of the Palestinian Authority, so there is no succession officially within the government. In fact, the only thing that we have to go on really is Palestinian basic law, which stipulates that the Speaker of Parliament should step in for a 2-month period. And the Speaker of Parliament right now is Aziz Dwig, who is a member of Hamas. So get a sense of what kind of crisis could loom as a result of Abbas leaving the scene. This is why it's so important for whatever happens that there needs to be actually a structure that we can rely on, not a person, but a structure within the Palestinian Authority, and that has been lacking for years.
After World War I, at the Zionist behest, the British created a unit called Palestine. The Muslim Arabic speakers of that area had no affinity for this new region. But rather quickly they realized this is the game in town and they better adapt. And over the course of a century, they have adapted and adopted this term. It used to be a Zionist term, the Palestine Post, the Palestine Symphony. It was a symbol of the victory of Zionism that this term had come into use. After the Jews abandoned it, after the Zionists abandoned it, it became a term that was picked up, that was left on the table. It was picked up by the Muslim Arabs, who have since become very fervent Palestinians. So it is an invented, a century ago it didn't exist, but just as with Botswana or Niger, they have acquired, or Jordan for that matter, they've acquired a reality. And now it's there. So there's no point in disputing it. There are people who firmly believe themselves to be Palestinians.
I would like to refer to your first sentence, not to the rest, about pessimism. If I reflected pessimism, that was not my intention, because I'm an ultimate optimist. And as I mentioned before, Ben-Gurion founded the state with 650,000 Jews. Today we are 7 million Jews. He founded the state with roughly $1 billion GDP. Today we are approaching $350 billion GDP. And if you would have told Ben-Gurion, who probably was the ultimate optimist, acting at the time as a minority within his own Labour Party, when he decided to establish a Jewish state, if you would have told this ultimate optimist that, David, by the year 2018, the Jewish state is going to be the global co-leader, along with the US, in the area of developing and manufacturing of mini-size, small-size, and medium-size space shuttles. Even Ben-Gurion would have asked you, what have you been smoking and what have you been drinking? But here we are. I spent a few days in Miami before coming to Texas and here. And at one of my meetings, there was a retired Air Force combat pilot from the US. And I spoke about what has Israel done lately for America. And he came to me afterwards and he said, you know, I'm a retired combat pilot, and let me tell you that the best time, the most productive time for American combat pilots are joint maneuvers with the Israeli Air Force. Now, I wanted to be very polite, and I felt realistic, and I said, I appreciate the compliment, but it's very difficult for me to accept it, because aren't we using American hardware, the F-15, F-16, F-35, and don't tell me that the IQ of the Israeli pilots exceeds the IQ of American pilots. And his response was, well, you talk like a guy who knows nothing about Air Force, because he said it's true that you have the American hardware, but Israeli pilots, unlike the American combat pilots, every time Israelis take off, whether it's called training or operation, you're within enemy's radars range and enemy's missiles range. And you operate under do or die state of mind, which means you extend the capabilities of our hardware to an extent that we are never able to do, because we don't share that do or die state of mind. The only time when we are privy to this creative and audacious maneuvers that your pilots are developing is when we have joint exercises, joint maneuvers with the Israeli Air Force. And this is one of litany of Israeli headways, which leads me to be mighty optimist, absolutely not pessimist, and a person who recognizes realistic complications and hurdles is not a pessimist, he's a realist.
But there are winners and there are losers in war. I can't go back to my ancestors' homes in Europe. You know, that it's over. The 1948 war is over. The Kurdish people have been around for centuries. Do they have a state yet? I mean, what we are doing by giving in to this terrorism, by rewarding them in statehood, is bad for the long-term national security interests of the United States, when radical Islamic terrorism is really the scourge of the 21st century. So we can't just, you know, just because people have a right for self-determination, sure, I would like to go back to my, you know, ancestors', you know, home in Hungary that apparently they had acres and acres of land. It's not going to happen. And just to have, you know, this kind of wish, unless you behave in a civilized manner, and you purport yourself among the community of nations, it's not going to happen. I'm sorry. Yes.
We all have our views, but our campaign, our Israel Victory Project, is what we call solution agnostic. In other words, we want to take it to the point that the Palestinians realize that they have lost. It's not a declaration. It's a profound sense of failure. And those of you who are old enough to remember May 1st, 1975, know what I mean. We lost. It was over. Nobody has since said, you know what, let's give it another try and go back to Vietnam. We lost. We didn't run out of bullets, out of manpower, of dollars, we ran out of will. So now listen to them. They lost. At that point, I would argue to you that no matter what your next step is, whatever your favorite solution is, you mentioned a couple, and if it's a two-state solution or one-state solution, sovereignty for Israel in the West Bank, whatever it might be, whatever the solution you have in mind is, you're better off trying to achieve it with the Palestinians defeated. So we don't go further. And part we don't go further because there's no point in arguing something like this so far in advance. In part, we're trying to build a coalition that includes people who disagree with each other over what should come next. So we hope So let's get to the point that Palestinians realize profoundly, have a change of heart, and don't continue not just the violent attacks, but also say to the United Nations, stop in general. So when the happy day comes, that the Palestinians are no longer dedicated towards the destruction of the Jewish state, then one can begin to develop plans. Let me add something you didn't ask about, which is, I've been looking for an opening. Why do the Palestinians continue to think that they can win? As I said before, every objective indicator suggests they've lost, but they continue. I'm going to give you three main reasons why. The first is Islamic doctrine, the notion of a waqf, W-A-Q-F, that a territory that's come under Muslim control must remain in perpetuity, and if it's not, it has to be regained. Number one. Number two is worldwide support. This is not some obscure African liberation front. This is number one favorite of leftist and Muslim and other forces around the world. Number three is the timidity of the Israeli government, if we're insignificant. But, take Gaza. Take the kite and balloon attacks. For weeks and weeks and weeks, the defense forces did nothing except try and knock down the kites. Only under public pressure did they finally start doing something against those who attacked them. And that is indicative of the Israeli defense establishment, which wants quiet, doesn't want to upset anything. And therefore the Palestinians draw the conclusion that the defense forces are weak. They're not. But the timidity of the defense forces encourages the Palestinians. So those are three main factors. No effect.
No effect. Sure. As you know, there have been reports recently about Jared Kushner in particular taking an active interest in UNRWA, but we've seen members of Congress as well as others within the administration talking about reforming UNRWA. UNRWA receives, I think, somewhere between $200 and $250 million in U.S. taxpayers, $360 million a year in U.S. taxpayer funds. It's a remarkable thing given that there are actually only roughly 20 to 30,000 of the original refugees left. This is, of course, kind of a back-of-the-envelope estimate, but it's based on the fact that there were 800,000 or less, 625, well, people disagree on the actual number. UN number says 625. Palestinians will say it's closer to 800, which is roughly the same as what the Jewish refugees from the Arab world were. But at the end of the day, those people died off over time, and you're now down to a minimal number, a much more manageable number when the Palestinians continue to call for the so-called right of return. These people want to live in what they call Palestine, and they want to live in what's basically Israel. That's a number that the Israelis can absorb. They can't obviously absorb 5 million people, and this is ultimately what the reform is about. Now, the question then becomes, how can the administration turn that into policy? By, for example, starting to defund UNRWA, which we have seen already, withholding funds until reform starts to take place, but more importantly, trying to get the Palestinians to redefine the total number of refugees. And by the way, I should note here that that doesn't necessarily mean that Palestinians would cease to receive some kind of UN aid. It's just that you wouldn't have the political distinction any longer of having the descendants of refugees maintaining that refugee status. Because right now you have the children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren of those original refugees being deemed refugees themselves. That is untenable. So the question now is, with the administration taking this action, can we begin to take the refugee issue off the table and move forward on some of the other core issues? That appears to be at least the approach that this administration is considering, and I, for one, would applaud it.
Well, you are recapitulating a different version of my three reasons.
Yes.
Why the Palestinians believe they can win. But I would not be talking to this intelligent Palestinian. I would count on the Israelis taking steps to show the Palestinians that this isn't working. And I've also suggested to them that once you give up your foul, irredentist goal of trying to eliminate the Jewish state of Israel, you Palestinians can get out of the oppression and backwardness in which you now live and can start to build your own polity, economy, society, and culture. It is only when you stop this war that you can build something good for yourself. I mean, if you compare Israel with the Palestinians, Israel is a functioning, wealthy, powerful, rule of law, democracy. It's a good life. I mean, all the polls show the Israelis are a happy people. Opposite with the Palestinians. If the Palestinians ever want to improve, they have to quit this. So, yes, I acknowledge everything you're saying. There are good reasons why the Palestinians have continued against all odds to think that they can win. But I believe we should support, and I'm saying this as an American, not trying to tell the Israelis what to do, but as an American, I'd like our president to say to their prime minister at some point, these present ones or future ones, Prime Minister, do what you need to do to win the war, and we will back you in that, within moral, legal, and practical limitations. What steps can the Israelis take? Well, I give you one very small example, more broadly, Gaza in general, but look at those kites. The Israeli military and other defensive elements were passive. That's not the right approach. Broadly speaking, the Israeli defense establishment is like a grand police force. It wants things quiet. Police forces don't go out for victory. Generals go out for victory. Want to win, want to defeat the enemy, want to crush the will of the enemy. That's not what police do. Police want quiet. Nobody harmed today. Good news. Military go out and people get harmed, but they have a goal. So what I'm hoping is that the Israelis will realize, as we heard earlier, there used to be a goal of deterrence. That goal was lost. From 1948 to 93, until also, the Israeli goal was deterrence, was to show the enemies of Israel, it's too painful, don't do this. And they got a long way. But in 1993, they let that go. And they went for appeasement. And after appeasement, they went for unilateral withdrawal. And after unilateral withdrawal in 2007 or so, they turned to putting out brush fires. And that's what you see today, for example, in Gaza, is putting out brush fires. So what I'm hoping is the Israelis will return to the policy of deterrence and show their enemies, don't harm us, we will pay a very high price. So there was a leaked testimonial by the chief of staff of the Israeli military in front of a Knesset committee, in which I think it was Naftali Bennett was pressing the chief of staff, Eisenberg, about why he wasn't doing something about the kite centers. And it ended up with Eisenberg saying, it's against my morals to do anything to take them out. At which point you go, that's what the Israeli military is for. It's for watching, standing by as they send over incendiary devices. Of course you take them out. I'm not an Israeli colonel. I'm not going to make field decisions about what they should be doing. But it was the Israeli public that eventually pushed it. Let me give another example. A year ago, you may recall that there was two border guards, Israeli border guards, were murdered in Jerusalem using weapons that were stored in the Temple Mount. And the immediate response on the Israeli side was to put in metal detectors. Public polls showed, endorsed this, the Knesset endorsed this, the Prime Minister endorsed this. Within 2 weeks they were gone. Why were they gone? Because the security services whispered in everybody's ear and said, if you keep those there, there'll be another intifada. The Palestinian Authority might collapse, take them out. So they did. It's this timidity. So I don't have the specifics in mind, but the Israelis' timidity has been a major force in the Palestinian sense that they have a victory.
The whole synopsis ignores the most important element, certainly for any U.S. congressman. What's the American interest in all that? And once again, I go back to the fundamental, in my mind, reality. Israel on the Golan Heights, Israel on the mountain ridges of Judea Samaria, constitutes an irreplaceable, unique American outpost which has yielded a rate of return on your annual investment in Israel, which some call erroneously foreign aid, the $3.1 billion, hundreds of percent, few 100% rate of return every single year, and by even discussing anything close to what you raised, you're basically literally saying, okay, let's transform that unique asset, otherwise called the Jewish state, into a real burden, a real liability. The last thing as an Israeli, the last thing that I would like to see are American troops or American guarantees serving as the defense of Israel. It contradicts the whole Zionist idea. It contradicts common sense. Common sense for any country that wants to survive, especially in the Middle East. And therefore, I go back to what I mentioned before. It seems to me that it's time to focus on the primary issues in the Middle East rather than be hooked up to the tumbleweeds on the road.
Right before I left office, Rafa, in one of our last conversations, thanked me for all my efforts and told me the great man I was. Mr. Chairman, I replied, I am not a great man. I am a failure, and you have made me. What we do not want to see over and over again is American prestige and investment in a peace process, quote-unquote peace process, which will only make us look, once again, as a failure. I want to thank you very much for coming, and I hope you enjoyed this